If you're good at something and you have a God-given talent, then you have responsibility to share it with other people, to teach and to inspire other people. A good example of this is sports people, racing drivers, footballers, whatever. And when you've got that talent, you are aware of your worth. Ayrton Senna famously negotiated a contract when he was driving for McLaren with Ron Dennis of a salary of $1 million per race. And Ayrton didn't need the money. He came from a very wealthy family. And in fact, he set up a charitable foundation in Brazil called the Sanina Foundation for underprivileged kids. But the reason he charged McLaren $1 million per race was because he knew he was worth it. And it was just a matter of principle to prove a point. And around the world, pilots, ship's captains, train drivers are paid much better than bus drivers or lorry drivers. Because pretty much everybody drives, the skill of driving has been devalued. And most people would regard a pilot or a train driver as being much more skilled, maybe intelligent. But the truth of the matter is, if you're driving really, really well, you're using the psychomotor part of your brain, and you're using it to a very high degree, especially because you're using it in very confined areas. If you're driving through busy cities, and your sense of prediction and lots of other qualities instincts have to be really, really sharp. Possibly more so than a train driver, possibly more so than a pilot, but that doesn't get recognized. The way I teach people to drive, I use the didactic, Socratic, and facilitative training technique. When you first start driving, if you haven't driven a large vehicle before, it can be overwhelming and scary. So it's very important that I give the trainees very clear instructions, tell them when to stop, when to go, when to turn the wheel to avoid a collision. That's the initial stage of learning, where you get told to do something and you just follow your instructions. Gradually, as the trainees get better, I move on to the Socratic method, named after Socrates, the Greek philosopher, where I will give them a hint and give them some information and see how they form a decision. So, for example, I may say to them, how long do you think that traffic light's been green for, and do you think it might change? To see how they react to that. I might say to them, there's a person sitting in that car, what do you think might happen? To see if they're aware of the person in the car and if they realize that the car door may open. So once they've got to a stage where they can pretty much drive without instruction, that's usually about 3 to 4 weeks into training, then I use the facilitative method, where I pretty much let them drive, and after an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours of very intense driving, we stop, we analyze the drive, and I can pretty much record the drive for 2 hours in my head, and I'll just play back the drive for them, pointing out every fault, where they could have done better, and we'll discuss it. So didactic, Socratic, and facilitative training. As well as that, we use the EDP method, which is explanation, demonstration, and practice. So a lot of the time I will use a whiteboard and I'll draw out what we need to do in training, because people learn best visually. I'll then demonstrate it, or in some cases I'll get the other trainee to demonstrate it, because you can learn just as well from watching another trainee drive who's at test standard as you can from watching me. And then obviously practice. So the third part of EDP is practice, and I do a lot of circuit work, meaning that I'll choose a route, a particularly tight route, once they've got to a virtual test standard, and we'll just go round and round and round, and every time they do a circuit they'll get better and better. So for example, circuits I use are, in the very beginning, Scotch Common and Ealing, 4 roundabouts which encompass left and right turns, some very tight roundabouts there, which really teach them to bring the bus down to literally 1 mile an hour. We're talking about half walking speed to get around some corners. And then obviously we progress onto that from the easier roundabouts. And then we move on to the U3 route in Uxbridge, which has got some very tight meeting situations and corners. Then we'd use 371 route in Richmond, which is incredibly tight. The actual road in some places it's narrower than the bus. It's like 7.5 feet wide, and the bus is 8 feet 2 inches wide. So you've got to use both sides of the road to get through, and that means you've got to meet oncoming traffic really well. Because I've got an interest in aviation and psychology, I use a lot of peripheral knowledge in my training. So I'll draw on my experience from flying. I'll draw on my knowledge from studying the airline transport pilot's license syllabus. And I'll draw on my knowledge of psychology, the kind of psychology that pilots get trained in, to give my trainees an understanding of what they're doing. When you do something and you're aware of what you're doing, so you're checking yourself, that's what we call metacognition. It's when, for example, an adult is doing something and they're thinking about what they're doing, they're monitoring themselves. But with trainees, their driving is more what we call phenomenological. It means that they can do something, but when you question them at the end of it, at the end of the task, they might not remember what they did because they're concentrating so hard, it starts to become a bit of a blur. And you shouldn't be embarrassed by this. If somebody says to you, do you remember that you hit that curb, or do you remember that the traffic light was red? You may not remember because you're concentrating so hard, so don't feel bad, but obviously learn from that and try and remember in future. What happens when we're teaching is sometimes with a particularly new trainee or a trainee who's struggling, the instructor can get quite tired. The instructor can be tired for many reasons. They could have problems at home, or whatever. They could have some sort of they could be sick. But what happens then is the instructor starts to over-instruct. So they start picking on every little thing, and they don't realize that they're not really giving the trainee enough time to take on what they're saying. The trainee might not fully understand what they're being told, and as the trainee starts to make mistakes, the instructor gets more and more ratty. That's what we call over-instructing. The opposite of that is under-instructing, where the instructor may seem to the trainee to be disinterested. So the trainee is just driving, and the instructor isn't really giving them any feedback. So they're not congratulating them, they're not pointing out mistakes as they happen, or they just seem to be too laid back, and the trainee thinks that the instructor's lost interest. So it's important that you balance your teaching and you're not over-instructing or under-instructing, and that applies for anything in life, even if you're dealing with children. Just want to mention something about the highway code and giving way. You must have seen that there are new rules in the highway code about giving way to cyclists, and that hasn't clearly been thought out, because, for example, it says in the highway code that if you're turning left and there are pedestrians crossing the road, you should stop for them. Well, as a matter of courtesy, you should do that anyway. But when you're driving a large vehicle, a lorry, or especially a bus, because a bus has got a lower floor and you can't see underneath the bus, there are some occasions where you stop for pedestrians where you're actually causing a hazard, and that hasn't been really thought out when they wrote the highway code. There are lots of mistakes in the highway code, but that's one of them. Because what you're actually doing is you're actually creating a blind spot. So if you imagine, if you're crossing the road at a zebra crossing and there's a bus stop for you, it does happen sometimes where you see people on cycles or scooters and they pass the bus and they nearly knock somebody on the zebra crossing over. Well, obviously, when you stop at a zebra crossing, it's the law, you have to stop. But what you should do in that situation is you should hold back and try and stop maybe about 10 or 15 feet away from the zebra crossing, so you give the pedestrians a clear view of what might be coming around the bus. When you're turning left, if you stop for somebody to cross the road, you've got to bear in mind that you're actually creating a blind spot for the pedestrians, and a cycle or a motorcycle might come around you, and the pedestrians might not see them, and they might not see the vehicle, or they might not see the pedestrians. So you've got to think, if you're going to stop for somebody, you need to hold well back. And this isn't explained in the highway code. They tell you that you've got to give way to pedestrians when you're turning, or give way to cyclists when you're turning, but they don't tell you that you are creating the blind spot, so you need to hold well back. When we drive, we're using what we call psychomotor skills, the psychomotor part of our brain. And we're also using something called muscle memory. We use muscle memory for everything, if you're writing, if you're walking. And there's something called gross muscle memory and fine muscle memory. And gross muscle memory is, for example, walking, or maybe using your hand to open a door, or, for example, picking something up. Yeah. Fine muscle memory is different. It's sometimes limited to just one hand. If you're right-handed, you normally just write with your right hand, and if you try and write with your left hand, it can be quite difficult. It's probably worth actually mentioning now that people should be trained to use both hands from a very young age, just in case they lose one hand in an accident. God forbid if you ever lost a hand, you'd suddenly then be dependent on the other hand to do everything. And it's worth learning to be, both-handed, if you like, from a very young age, so that your muscle memory and your psychomotor skills develop equally on both sides. I try and use my left hands sometimes when I'm doing something, a task, and just to get the left hand more dexterous, so it can. I mean, I can't write with my left hand, but it may be something else, like maybe operating my phone with the left hand. Just to get used to using it a little bit more. So apart from muscle memory, there's also something called cross-coupling, and pilots get trained about this. The rest of you and many drivers don't know what it is. They've not been taught about it. But basically, when you, for example, drive a car, you have to release the clutch and press the gas pedal at the same time. And that's called coordination. That's desirable. But cross-coupling is when something happens and you don't want it to happen. So, for example, every time you check your mirrors, you turn the steering wheel, without wanting to. That's cross-coupling. A good example of cross-coupling that I can demonstrate to you is, just imagine you're sitting on a chair, and you try and draw a figure 6 with your hand in the air, and then you try and do the same thing. You draw the figure 6, but then with your leg, you try and make an anti-clockwise circle. So with your leg, you're making a circle, and with your hand, you're trying to draw number 6 in the air. And you'll see that the moment you try and do the same thing when you're drawing with your leg, your hand can't do it. It's because they're two very, very simple tasks, but when you put them together, it's almost impossible. And I'm sure you could probably learn to do it. I'm not saying it's totally impossible, because the pilots that fly the Apache helicopters in America, the kind that Prince Harry flies, the gunships, they get taught to use their eyes independently. So one eye has to be able to move independently of the other eye. So the one eye is actually on the weapon system for targeting where the weapon system looks at, and the other eye is used to read the instruments and fly the helicopter. And that's absolutely amazing. The pilots that do this will tell you that in training initially they suffer from terrible headaches because they have to learn to use the eyes independently, but it can be taught.